El Cid was a famous Castilian knight from the 11th century. He is today really a national hero for Spain, and he's very much shrouded in legend and myth. There are two really big myths, I think, that persist. One is older and one is newer. The first, of course, is the idea that he was this ideal, perfect knight. The second is a more modern day myth and fits with the character of our times, and that's this idea that he was in fact the opposite of that. He was a nihilistic mercenary. Although he, was from Christian Spain, or from Christian portions of Spain, he was not at all interested in the Christian religion. He was willing to fight for Moors or Christians as long as they paid him well. And the idea of him as some kind of Christian hero is just ridiculous. So I want to take a look at these two myths and see what is the truth about El Cid. What can we get at the historical man? All the legends aside, El Cid's life in itself is remarkable. This is a guy who was born to mid-level nobility in the Kingdom of Castile. He was exiled by the King of Castile, Alfonso VI, in 1081, lost everything, lost his lands and his wealth, plied his trade as a mercenary captain, served the Moorish Emir of Zaragoza, but through his wit, through his skill as a commander, he carved out an independent principality for himself in the most unlikely of locations, the city of Valencia in the eastern part of Spain. This was one of the old cities of Al-Andalus. It had been in the hands of the Moors since the early conquest, and it was one of the wealthiest cities in all of Spain at the time. He conquered it, he held it against several counter-invasions from the Almoravids. The Almoravids were this powerful North African Berber sect that came to dominate Spanish Islam in the 1080s, and at that time also became a serious threat to the Christian kingdoms of the north. El Cid was the only guy at the time who could beat them. He defeated them in battle twice, repelled several invasions, and he did this while being vastly outnumbered. So the guy was incredible. He in fact never lost a battle in his life. It's no wonder that he became a legend. By the late 12th century and early 13th century, this was the height of the age of the Crusades, and the concept of the perfect Christian knight, the chivalric ideal, was really coming into focus. And it was celebrated in songs and poetry, and no knight was more celebrated in this way than El Cid. Of course, El Cid lived much earlier than this period of time, but there were a lot of poems and songs that celebrated his exploits. The most important of these is one of the great poems of the Middle Ages, the Song of the Cid. It portrays him in a way that is more in fitting with the ideals of that era. So El Cid is portrayed in this poem as the perfect knight, the flawless man. He never does anything wrong. He's perfect in his virtues. So the Song of the Cid does not give us a historical image of the Cid. It gives us a poetic image of him. It tells us a lot more about the ideals of the age of chivalry than it does about the Cid himself. The next major myth I think we can identify about the Cid is the more present-day myth. This is the idea that El Cid was a purely self-interested mercenary. He was not at all a legitimate Christian. In fact, he didn't care about Christianity. He was willing to fight for Christian or Moorish rulers, depending on who was willing to pay him the most. One prevalent idea I've noticed in the chatter on the internet is this notion that El Cid was a pluralist in the modern sense. He didn't care about differences between Christians and Muslims. He would have anybody in his retinue, regardless of their religion. He scoffed at that difference, much in the way that somebody from the 21st century might scoff at that difference. This is not true. If we take a look at the historical man, we'll see that this is not true. The truth about El Cid, as is the case with most historical figures who are embellished by myth, is that he was very much a man of his age. He was certainly a man looking to make his way in the world, especially after he lost everything when he was exiled. But he was also a pious Christian, especially by the standards of the day. He resembles the other Christian rulers of the day. And this is the late 11th century when crusading ideas were beginning to take shape and influence the way Christian rulers were thinking. And El Cid is most certainly a good example of germinating Crusader ideas. So let's take a look at this. First of all, El Cid was exiled by King Alfonso VI in 1081. This was a huge turning point in the man's life. Again, he lost everything. And that loss of status, that loss of his wealth, his lands, this meant that he had to start from nothing. He really was put in the position of becoming a mercenary. This is what he knew how to do. He was a man of war. He needed to sell his sword to the highest bidder. The first place he went was the Count of Barcelona, who was a Christian, and he refused to take the Cid on. Next, he went to the Emir of Zaragoza, and this is actually a very interesting choice for El Cid. One thing we will note about El Cid, and Joseph O'Callaghan, who wrote a great history of medieval Spain, he points this out. El Cid, although he was exiled from his native kingdom, from Castile, he always held a certain loyalty to the kingdom of his birth. El Cid and King Alfonso VI had an interesting relationship. There was quite a bit of tension between them. Indeed, there were times when it was just open hostility. But again, their relationship was ambiguous. There was a certain loyalty between the two of them that is evident at certain times. El Cid certainly seems to have had a certain loyalty to King Alfonso VI that never quite left him, even during some of the darkest days of his exile. And this makes sense. Castile was the kingdom of his ancestors. This was his homeland. For a knight of that age, there was going to be a strong urge to maintain ties to that. I think it would probably be helpful to look at why this tension existed between Alfonso VI and the Cid. And that is that El Cid started off in the household of Alfonso's brother, Sancho. And Sancho was king of Castile prior to Alfonso VI. There was a lot of tension between these two brothers. In fact, they hated each other. Sancho II made El Cid his highest-ranking military officer. Sancho was killed under a cloud of suspicion, which seemed to point toward his brother Alfonso being involved. Alfonso becomes king at that point, and so you can see where there would be tension between Alfonso and El Cid, who had been so high-ranking in his hated brother's military entourage. Nevertheless, the Cid was a very capable commander, and so Alfonso continued to use him. But at a certain point, the tension became too much, and Alfonso exiled the Cid. And not entirely unjustifiably, El Cid, although he was a great commander, he could also be a bit of a maverick. And at one point, he led a raid against certain Moorish territories that were tributary to King Alfonso, and that was the pretext for Alfonso kicking El Cid out. It's not an unreasonable reason to exile someone, but at the same time, we can see that there were tensions there even before that. Once the Cid went into exile, as I said earlier, he did at first try to enter the service of the Christian Count of Barcelona. When that was rejected, he went to the Emir of Zaragoza. Traditionally, Zaragoza paid tribute to the Christian kings of Leon Castile. So the King of Castile, Alfonso VI, had very strong interests in this region. And Joseph O'Callaghan points out that the Cid probably felt that he was still maintaining some connection to his ancestral kingdom by serving the Emir of Zaragoza, because the Emir of Zaragoza, again, he paid tribute to King Alfonso VI. His interests tended to line up with the interests of the kingdom of Leon and Castile. El Cid's service to the Emir of Zaragoza is not surprising at all. It doesn't make him a unique individual in terms of his thinking at this time. Christian and Moorish powers made alliances back and forth with one another all the time. This was just how the game was played. But this doesn't detract from the fact that there was this broader religious struggle going on as well. As is the case with human beings, they have multiple motivations, sometimes even motivations that are at odds with one another. And every Christian and Moorish lord, he had his just his personal ambitions, his personal power he was looking out for, but he also had this broader issue of the struggle between, these two great religious factions. And, both sides wavered back and forth and participated in that to varying degrees. But we should not discount the importance of this religious divide. Historian Bernard Riley points out that the religious divide in medieval Spain was the most important distinction between peoples. The thing that overwhelmingly defined a person's loyalties was his religion. Were you a Christian? Were you a Muslim? Were you a Jew? And Bernard Riley actually says that next to these differences, all other distinctions and differences in medieval Spain at this time paled in comparison. So that kind of gives us an idea of the mentality of this period. So the fact that El Cid was willing to sell his sword to a Moorish emir, the fact that he was willing to make an alliance with a Moorish ruler when it was convenient for him, this doesn't make him different than the various Moorish and Christian powers of his age, but also even as we get into the crusading period, this was true. In the Crusader states themselves, in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, they made alliances with various Muslim powers back and forth. But again, this didn't change the fact that there was this overall greater religious struggle that was going on. Sometimes we get this talking point that, okay, well, prior to the age of the Crusades, things were more fluid. There was less of a religious distinction in the Iberian Peninsula. Christians and Moors were willing to fight alongside each other more easily. But the problem with this is that when you look at the way people looked at the Reconquista, even during the 11th century, even back to the 9th century, you look at the chronicles, you look at the way Christians and Moors were writing about this stuff, they were very conscious of this religious issue even back then. So I think that we have to look at these various cross-religious alliances as far more issues of convenience. El Cid's service to the Emir of Zaragoza, this was something he did because he had to do it. I mean, this is the very definition of the alliance of convenience. He had lost everything. He'd been exiled. He needed somebody to pay him to fight, and he went to someone who was willing to do that. Once El Cid becomes a ruler in his own right, then we get a lot better sense of his loyalties. He becomes Prince of Valencia. He conquers Valencia. And there is this myth out there that he basically presided over an entirely pluralistic society. He almost abolished differences between Christians and Moors. He wasn't interested in that. And everybody was totally loyal to him. The Christians and Moors living under him, they all loved him equally. This is kind of pushed in the 1960s Charlton Heston film, El Cid. It's kind of a fun movie, but it's not historically accurate. El Cid established a regime that was typical for Moorish and Christian powers, in that it placed his own religion at the center. First of all, we need to keep in mind that pluralistic states, this is a modern thing. There was no such thing in the Middle Ages. El Cid most certainly established Christian dominance in Valencia. He converted the main mosque into a cathedral, which he dedicated to the Blessed Virgin, to Mary, the mother of Jesus. He expelled a fairly large number of Moors from Valencia, and he brought in Christians from the surrounding countryside to take their place within the city. There were several serious revolts against his rule by the Moorish population, at which point he expelled more Moors. He was very harsh with the instigators of the rebellion, especially early on before there were these rebellions against his rule by various Moorish factions. He did establish a fair rule with the Moors living under him. He allowed them to live according to their laws, which, but again, this was typical of Christian rulers at the time. Alfonso VI did something similar when he conquered Toledo from the Moors. The Crusaders did the same thing when they established the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the Latin East. So again, we can't look at this and say that this is somebody who disregarded the norms of his age. No, this was somebody who was very much in tune with the norms of his age. It's also interesting that when El Cid reestablished the Christian cathedral in Valencia, he brought in a Frenchman to be the bishop. a man named Jerome. And this was somebody who came from the Cluniac school of France. The Abbey of Cluny was the center for the Reformed papacy, for the Reform ideology that was becoming so important in the West at this time. And also it was the place where the ideas of crusade were really taking shape and germinating. The Cluniac popes had their eye on Spain, and they really viewed the struggle there between the Christians and Moors as a model for how they viewed the function of the Christian knightly elite, like how they thought that they should ultimately function as defenders of Christendom. So they viewed Spain as kind of at the forefront of this crusading ideology that was beginning to develop. El Cid made it a point to have Jerome go to Rome to be confirmed by Pope Urban II. There were a couple of reasons for this. On the one hand, he wanted to affirm Valencia as in good standing with the church, this new conquest that he'd established, but he also wanted to be in line with the direction of the times. And finally, I think it's important to note that El Cid, in terms of his contemporaries, he was viewed very positively by the Christians, especially by the Christians living under his rule. The idea that the Moors also loved him, this is a total myth. The Moors respected him. They recognized that he was a great commander. He was a brilliant warrior, but they despised him. Our two main Moorish sources for his life, Ibn al-Qama and Ibn Bassam, both clearly detested him. They viewed him as an oppressor. They viewed his conquest of Valencia as a disaster for the Moorish world, for Valencia itself. And these were two Arab writers who were close to the action of this too, so they are primary sources for this. So that tells us something also. So I think this helps us get a better idea of who El Cid was. He was not, the ideal of the 13th century. He also wasn't a nihilistic mercenary, pure and simple. He was most certainly a man out to make a name for himself in the world, to make his way in the world, but he also was a sincere Christian ruler, and he resembles the Christian rulers of his era quite a bit. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll talk to you soon.